Warhammer 40k has a lot of factions, and those factions each have a lot of units in them. So when you're looking at all the units from all the factions in the game, it can be pretty daunting. So today, I thought it would be cool to break down every faction in the game and talk about the one very best unit in each of those armies. Let's do it! What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're doing something a little silly. This is actually a discussion that came up on the Discord earlier this week, and I loved it so much that I decided to make it into a video. So if you're not in the Discord, there's a link down in the description. We play 40k online all the time there. We talk about 40k. There's list building being done and advice being given. It's a wild time, so I highly recommend you go check out the Discord if you aren't there already. But while you're here, let's talk about all of these different units in 40k. Now, I'm going to use some rules of thumb when talking about all of these different units. First off, it's important to note I'm going to be looking at them through the lens of 2,000 point GT 2020 format 40k. A lot of units get better or worse depending on the points size and the mission format you're playing. So 2,000 points GT 2020, the standard format for 40k, and especially competitive 40k, is where we are looking at. I'm also looking for units that are good in a wide variety of list archetypes or sub-factions. So, if you have something that might be incredibly powerful, but only fits into a single list in that faction, that's not necessarily what we're going to be looking at. Something that fits into, basically every list that you bring with that army is going to get preferential treatment in this list. For the most part, unless there's a very good reason for it to be included, I'm going to avoid troops choices, because looking at that previous rule, you could say like, oh man, Intercessors are the best unit in Space Marines because they're good in every Space Marine list. Like, come on, every list has troop choices, so we're going to mostly ignore those unless they are the backbone of a list, both offensively and in a utility sense. I'm not going to be covering every faction keyword in the game. We'll talk about some of the weirder factions in here, some of the little mini sub-factions and stuff. So we'll get a little bit crazy, but I'm not going to put in an entry for, like, Aeronautica Imperialis or Astra Telepathica or whatever all of those little weird Imperium sub-faction keywords are. We're just mostly talking about each factions that can take detachments of their own units. And one last note before we get into it. If you enjoyed this style of content, go ahead and drop a like, drop a subscribe on the video. Helps let me know that y'all like this stuff, and then I can make more of this kind of video. This is kind of a weird one. It's very experimental, so let me know if you like it down below. Anyway, let's do it, and let's get started with the Xenos factions of Warhammer 40k. And we'll get started with the factions that are all by themselves, that are not in a super faction. So, how about Necrons? They've been waiting underneath the ground of their tomb worlds for millions of years, and this #1 unit in the faction will certainly assist them in their awakening. It is the Canoptek Scarab. These things are fast, they're cheap. For 15 points a model, you get 4 wounds, move 10, the ability to get OBSEC off of Eternal Conquerors, and you can basically see Canoptek Scarabs in almost every Necron list that's ever been made. They're just great. Another unit I considered adding in here was the Chronomancer. It does have a good synergy with Scarabs, which I think is good. It also has good synergy with almost every other Necron core unit. Being able to give them that 5+ invulnerable save is phenomenal, and the Chronomancer kind of slaps as well. He's like a laser destroyer as a gun, which is pretty sweet. Moving on, we have Orcs next, and the #1 for Orcs is actually the winner of our #1 Best Smash character list. That is the War Boss on Warbike. This guy's insane. He does boatloads of damage. He's fast. Once he's upgraded with Biggest Boss, he's hard to kill. Once he gets the Killer Claw and Warlord traits and everything stacked on top of him, he goes absolutely crazy. And the best thing is, he goes into every single Orc list. Like a Thraka list, you can't Biggest Boss that guy, so he's not quite as good, but even then, he's still probably fine. Every list should have a War Boss and Warbike. Moving on to Tau Empire. This one is actually super hard. Not least because Tau Empire doesn't see a ton of play, so I'm not 100% sure what the #1 best unit in the Codex is, but so what's hilarious here, and what may be hilarious as we move on through the list, is in some cases how hilariously wrong I am. But the Tau Empire selection I have made is the Crisis Battlesuit Commander. Tau Empire armies don't tend to do a ton of damage themselves. They have good ranged output, and especially if you're shooting at Drukhari stuff, their damage output is actually incredible because they have a lot of mid-range shooting, which is perfect for killing Drukhari. And one of the best applicators of that is the Battlesuit Commander. The Crisis Battlesuit Commander comes in at the cheapest points value for around around 150-ish points, you get a bunch of cyclic ion blasters or a bunch of missile pods on this guy. He's untargetable. He can just continue to shoot out those ranged attacks all game and deliver your Master of War auras as well. Some other honorable mentions I had in here. Broadside battlesuits, pretty good. Downside is that once you engage a unit of broadside battlesuits in melee, they don't do anything, but you do have to eat that Overwatch, especially with smart missile systems. It can be pretty gross. And if they're able to get the drop on you and shoot first, they do a bunch of damage, especially with the buffs that you can apply to them. Also, Remora stealth drones, a little aircraft guy that doesn't have to move with the airborne aircraft angling rules, and has some pretty decent damage output in and of itself, is pretty sweet. I like Remora stealth drones quite a bit. I don't know, Tau Empire is kind of sort of wide open right now because, I don't know, their stuff isn't that good. Poor Tau. Last in these non-super faction Xenos, let's talk about the unaligned units. Units that don't fit into any other faction. And the number one I have in here is the Imperial Bunker. Not the least because you can actually put it into a list by putting it into a fortification network. It just costs you a CP to buy the fortification network if it's not factioned with your regular faction. But the Imperial Bunker is actually pretty sweet. It's toughness 8, it's 12 wounds, it's sort of a very hard to kill dedicated transport, and you can put a bunch of models in it and they can shoot out. You can shoot 5 models out of it. So if you ever have an artillery unit, a ranged unit, a Devastator squad that you want to be able to shoot from your backline and not get interacted with by your opponent, you can buy an Imperial Bunker for 90 points and it just does that for you. You can also put guns on it. That's cool. I don't know. This thing's pretty cool. The downside is those fortification rolls, and honestly, unaligned units themselves not typically playable, so that's not really a huge issue, I think, in this category, but the fortification rules stop the Imperial Bunker from being set up. Now, if we were to remove the restriction of units that were actually playable outside an auxiliary support detachment, I would pick the Boreworm Infestation, I think. This thing comes in with the dreaded Amble kit and is actually sweet. It's a single swarm model for 15 points that deep strikes itself and can borrow and re-deep strike as the game goes on. Phenomenal. If you could bring this in your detachments without absolutely screwing up your army, then you would all the time. They score secondary objectives so well. Unfortunately, being unaligned, they don't really go into detachments. In GT 2020, you can't put them into any other detachment. They don't fit with the keywords. That's a list building restriction that GT 2020 has, so you'd have to bring them in an auxiliary support detachment, spend a bunch of CP, probably like break your combat doctrines or something to bring them in. It sucks, but the unit actually is really good if you were able to take it. Moving on to some of the other Xenos races, let's talk about Forces of the Hive Mind. First up, we have Gene Stealer Cults. I'm going to break my non-troops rule here by talking about Acolyte Hybrids, which are essentially the core of any Gene Stealer Cult army. And even better now that they got a couple weapon buffs in the 9th edition transition. Their flamers went up to 12-inch range, so their hand flamers are hyper lethal coming out of Deep Strike, which is phenomenal. They can just Deep Strike themselves for only 40 points for a unit of 5. If you just need a unit to go Deep Strike and do a objective or something like that, that's fine. But you can also kit them out to be really powerful in melee, jump a bunch of buffs on them, make them make that charge out of melee by using stratagems, and really mess some people up with buzz saws or mining drills. Moving on to Tyranids proper. This is a hard one for me as well. I had to sort of kill my babies here. And the Tyranid that has been the subject of my adoration throughout the entire time I'm playing the faction is the Swarmlord. You almost can't build a Tyranid list without this guy. He goes into every sub-faction just fine. He himself hits pretty hard. He has a good psychic phase. He's relatively difficult to kill. And he also lets you double move anything you want anytime during the game, which is just ridiculously powerful. If you're not building a Tyranid army with Swarmlord in it, you're doing something wrong. The guy's super good. I also, as an honorable mention here, had Hive Guard as well. They fit into a lot of lists, especially if you're running a more gunline-centric Tyranid army, which is very popular right now. And as long as they're not outranged or they don't have bad terrain or something, they're almost always worth their weight in gold on the tabletop. Moving on to Aeldari, let's talk about the Craft Worlds. This is another tough one. I elected to put the Lynx in the top spot. This thing is hard to kill. It has 1 billion wounds. It shoots super duper hard with a bunch of 3 flat damage ranged attacks, all of which can be buffed by Aeldar's particularly good ranged buffs. It's also super fast. It can move 30 inches if it needs to, which means it's very hard to pin down, especially with the fly keyword as well. The Lynx is actually just incredible. But some other incredible units in the faction that I consider putting in here, Dark Reapers I think are a good one, and probably the closest contender for the Lynx is actually just the Farseer himself. yourself probably just a Farseer Skyrunner, that guy running around in order to put those debuffs or defensive buffs on your army is super duper good. Or just to use him as a beat stick. I mean, he shoots 2 smites out with Executioner every turn, can deal upwards of 9 mortal wounds sometimes if your smites go particularly well. You know, shoots some shuriken catapults at somebody, throws a singing spear maybe every once in a while. Moving on to Drukhari. A lot of people would drop the Succubus in the top spot here because they're so efficient. Once you put warlord traits and stratagems on it, they go absolutely incredible. But I actually think the real option here is the Drukhari Raider. This thing for 85 points gives you a transport with move 14, fly, and invulnerable save, and a laser cannon on it. It's so good, not to mention the fact that it's open-topped, meaning that your units inside can shoot out, which is like just the heart of the Dark Technomancer's combo in Drukhari list right now. The Drukhari Raider is ridiculously undercosted and is super duper powerful in basically every way. It also punches well sometimes. Like, it's good in every phase of the game. It's ridiculous. Raiders are phenomenal. Moving on, we have a similar pick in Harlequins. I decided to pick the Star Weaver. There's definitely arguments to be made for Harlequin troops, but that violates my soft no troops rule. Or the Troop Master, maybe the Shadow Seer. All of those are pretty good, but really the power of Harlequins is defined by the Star Weaver, which allows you to deliver your Harlequin troop units all over the table wherever you want. And while it's not as flashy as Skyweavers, who can, you know, zip around the table, shoot the haywire cannons, get into melee, jump in and out of combat, Starweavers are just sort of the solid rock upon which the Harlequin's power is built. Unfortunately, Harlequins don't have a particularly big codex, so we could almost put everything in the codex at the top because all of their units are pretty good. Then moving on to the last Aeldari sub-faction, we have Ynnari. And honestly, the entire triumvirate of Yniad are pretty good. The Incarn sees play, he's pretty sweet. The Vizark is actually a deceptively good beatstick character that doesn't see enough play, I think. But Yvraine is absolutely the most flexible and the most playable of all of them. She just brings in a ridiculously powerful and consistent Psyker. Aeldari have this like particularly cute and mobile trio of characters where they bring a Farseer Skyrunner as well as a Shadow Seer and Yvraine. Both Yvraine and the Shadow Seer could go into a Starweaver out of a Harlequin's detachment, and they can zip around the table and do a bunch of mortal wounds with all of their custom smites every turn. The whole combo costs a bunch of points, but it does like 10 or 12 mortal wounds a turn if you're rolling pretty well on your psychic tests, which I absolutely love. And a lot of different Aeldari lists bring Yvraine just as that consistent psychic output. Now, speaking of psychic output, let's move on to the super faction that has maybe the second most reliance on psychic powers. That is the Minions of Chaos. And starting first with Chaos Demons, we're going to continue this Psyker train talking about the Lord of Change. Once you've applied Warlord traits and relics and exalted powers onto the Lord of Change, the Big Bird becomes an unkillable god of immovability that very few armies in the game can reliably remove from the table, all the while putting out relatively consistent psychic powers and pretty decent melee itself. Lord of Change actually melees better than a Bloodthirster, which is sort of wild. While it does require a lot of CP to fuel it, to turn on those exalted abilities and buy it, warlord traits and relics and stuff like that in order to make the Lord of Change as powerful as possible, it does fit into basically any mixed chaos list all by itself, which is why I put it up here over some other greater demon options. I think Keepers of Secrets are particularly good. Shalaxi Hellbane sees some play as well. And some of the demon infantry are pretty solid. Bloodletters have lost a lot of market share recently, but they're still playable. Horrors and Demonettes are good in Horde armies as well. There's actually a lot to like in the Chaos Demons Codex, but I think the number one most flexible pick is that Lord of Change. Moving on to Chaos Space Marines, this is another tough one, because Chaos Space Marines have a lot of different directions they can go in. In this case, I've decided to pick Noise Marines. They are a troop's choice if you take them in Emperor's Children, which is where you're mostly going to be taking them. But once they're buffed up to the gills, Noise Marines do a ridiculous amount of damage. They are the absolute heart of the Noise Marine combo. And honestly, that combo isn't particularly complicated. Really, all you need is a Dark Apostle buffing them up with the Remnant of the Maraviglia. And once you do that and apply your stratagems to that, you can usually just let them go do their thing. But getting Prescience, getting Warp Time, getting rerolls from another character, those are all phenomenal buffs to put on those Noise Marines and make them deal an insane amount of damage. Only a couple hundred points in a Chaos Space Marine or an Emperor's Children patrol or battalion will get you a pretty solid damage output unit at range. Moving on to the other types of Chaos Space Marines, we have Death Guard, and similarly to my top Death Guard units video, I am going to answer this the same way I did in that video. It is the Tally Man. This guy, he doesn't look like much, but it turns out giving +1 to hit to either a whole unit of Terminators or a Volkite Contemptor Dreadnought is pretty good, and giving you 5 CP over the course of the game, almost guaranteed, is insane value. Mortarion, probably another option in this slot for Death Guard, given how incredibly impactful he is, both in pure Death Guard lists and in mixed chaos lists, but anytime there is a Death Guard detachment on the table, there should probably be a Tally Man in it. And on top of that, he brings Tollkeeper along with him to give you exploding 6s on your ranged output units, which is phenomenal. And with that, we'll move on to Thousand Suns. And I think this one should be a little bit obvious if you've seen Thousand Suns detachments in any time, I think, ever. And it's Ahriman. This dude is phenomenal. He's not super expensive. You can bring him on a disc if you have extra points and you need him to be more mobile. But he's just one of the most consistent casters in the game. He has 3 casts. He knows a bunch of spells. He gets +1 to cast. It's all good, man. And if you need a support caster in Chaos Space Marines, you just throw Ahriman in there. He also is Heretic Astartes keyworded, so he can go into regular Heretic Astartes detachments if you don't care about breaking your Legion. Or he can bring in a Thousand Suns detachment, and if you want to bring the Rubric Bomb or something else, he can also do that, and gets the benefit of that extra psychic power range that you gain from being a pure Thousand Suns detachment. I don't really know if there's anything else in that Thousand Suns Codex that I would really put on the same level as him. Magnus, obviously, clearly is a powerful unit, but he's a little bit more situational and has to be brought in a list that supports him specifically. Whereas Ahriman sees play in basically every Chaos Space Marine list ever. Any list that really wants Warp Time or Prescience to go off, it's probably Ahriman casting that spell. Now, to bridge the gap between the Chaos subfactions and the Imperium subfactions, I figured I would roll 2 factions into one. Those being the Titan Legions and the Chaos Titan Legions. And I'm going to take a little bit of a shortcut here and just cut to the chase. We're going to put the Warhound Scout Titan in as the best actual Titan in 40k. Mostly for the reason that it's the only one you can legally bring in a 2,000 point army, because it is exactly 2,000 points. Now, pro tip of the day, don't do that. You'll lose, but it's fun that you can do it. Moving on to Knights, the Knight Megara, which is a unit that's sort of taking the game by storm. People wrote off Imperial Knights when 9th edition came out, and while solo Knight lists are still a little bit difficult to play, although they are starting to see some competitive play now that Drukhari are everywhere and Knights are a pretty reasonable counter, and especially at War in the Berg, recently we saw a pure Knight 5-0. Part of the heart of the power of that faction is the Knight Megara, which is just such an incredibly efficient profile, both in shooting and melee. Unlike most Knights, it has a 5+ invulnerable save all the time. It's just a stock invulnerable save, not the Ion Field save that most Knights have that turns off as soon as they're in melee, which means that because Imperial Knights have a different version of rotate Iron Shields than Chaos Knights, they can actually rotate their shields in melee as well, which makes them very difficult to remove anytime you want to be putting something with a few high-value attacks down on them. With the combination of Rad Cleansers, which are just an insane range profile, and a bunch of other very powerful ranged attacks, Megaras can deal a bunch of damage at range, force their opponent into engage into them in melee, and then put those big siege claws to use. I didn't talk about them earlier, but I'll staple Chaos Knights to Imperial Knights as well, and we'll take the cop-out here and say it is the Chaos Megara. That's probably the number one you're going to be playing. And with those Chaos and Imperium in-betweener factions out of the way, we'll move on to the bastion of humanity itself, the Imperium. And we'll start going down in alphabetical order with the Adepta Sororitas. Now, Sororitas have a lot of really powerful units, but only one of them really works exceptionally well across order keywords, and that is the Retributor Squad. At least in the current version of the Codex, I know Sororitas are getting a new codex relatively soon in the future. We're talking about the 8th edition version right now, and Retributor squads in that codex are phenomenally powerful. The ability to have a free simulacrum and just interacting phenomenally well with Miracle Dice means that you can be dropping a bunch of 6s for wound rolls or damage rolls on multi-meltas, use the Storm of Retribution stratagem to get extra range on them, and just be dealing enormous amounts of damage at 36 inches of range. With the proper application of Strat Bats and Miracle Dice, a Retributor squad should bail out of a transport and kill whatever it is they're shooting at, as long as it's sort of a big unit that can get killed in the 12 multi-belta shots that they get. A lot of the close range combat sister squads like Repentia, Seraphim, or Zephyrim really only work in Bloody Rose, whereas Retributor squads see play in a wide variety of orders. Almost every order, in fact, takes Retributor squads. It's just dependent on whether you're okay with losing some of the efficiency that comes with bringing them in our Martyred Lady or Ebon Chalice or something like that. But realistically, Retributor squads, super phenomenal. I guess shout out as well to the Rhinos. Sororitas Rhinos are obnoxious to kill, and I hate them. That might actually be the answer. But we're gonna go with the Retributor squad for now. It's a little sexier. Adeptus Custodes is next, and this one I actually racked my brain for ages on. Custodes, despite the fact that they only have a couple of data sheets in the whole faction, actually have a couple different varieties of builds that you see. Either there's a lot of infantry on the table, you can bring bikers, you can bring dreadnoughts. All of those builds are pretty good, but the one thing that you see in basically all of them is the Shield Captain on Dawn Eagle Jetbike. Now, this guy isn't super impressive. His damage output's okay. He's very difficult to kill, that is for sure, especially once you add his Shield Captain traits and relics and warlord traits and stuff on top of him. But just having a very tanky, very fast unit with objective secured that often gets character protection sometimes just sinks entire matchups. If your opponent can't dump a bunch of mortal wounds into him and kill him immediately, sometimes he just steals a bunch of primary objective points from them, and there's nothing they can do about it. Moving on to Adeptus Mechanicus, this one was kind of easy. Although Adeptus Mechanicus has a wide variety of super undercosted data sheets that really need to get revised when their new codex comes out. I think the number one on the pile of data sheets is the Cerberus Raider. This thing is just pure insanity. 3 wounds, even though it had just toughness 3, and with a 4+ save, 6+ a vulnerable save, the ability to get cover off of Shroud Psalm on turn 1. It's just so annoying to kill for only 16 points. On top of that, you get a pregame move, you get a decent gun, you get a solid melee profile. They're just really good. Their core stats are really good. And when you add on top of that the ability to buff their damage output with stuff like Wrath of Mars or Tactica Obliqua to make them functionally undamageable in melee, which is pretty annoying, Cerberus Raiders absolutely take the cake for the best unit in the Codex. Also, some honorable mentions. Archaeopter Fuselaps absolutely need some love. They are phenomenally undercosted. They do a boatload of damage. They're very hard to kill. And especially if they're fighting infantry, where their bombs go off with maximum efficiency, they can really, really tilt a matchup immediately in the Mechanicus' favor. Scorpius Disintegrators as well have always been good and will continue to be good, I think, even through the new book, unless they see some pretty impressive high price increases. Moving on to Astra Militarum, I think there's only one real pick here. That is the Manticore, and especially the Manticore with full payload. You see these taken a lot of times in other lists outside of Astra Militarum just to add some punchy indirect fire to their backline. And I think that speaks to the fact that it's a pretty good unit, especially for only 125 points for one of them. It's pretty solid to bring a 3 flat damage indirect fire artillery piece to your army. Moving on to Grey Knights, this was another kind of tough one. Grey Knights are in an awkward spot where their lists are very much in flux, although I don't know if anything that they're bringing right now is particularly powerful in and of itself. But the one unit that sees a lot of play almost regardless of the list archetype is Grey Knight Paladins. So we're going to put them in there at the top spot. Pretty tanky unit, although they're definitely kind of showing their age. They've lost a lot of their luster in comparison to more recent releases. Moving on to the Inquisition, I think it's pretty appropriate for the Inquisition that their best unit would be the Inquisitor, specifically a Psychic Inquisitor out of Ordo Xenos to allow them to bring esoteric lore that gives you a little bit of access to CP regen regardless of the subfaction you're in, allowing any Imperium list to gain access to not only a Psyker, as well as, sometimes crucially, forward deploy and an orbital bombardment, all of which can be useful in some situations, but also that all-important CP regen. Inquisitors are just great. Moving on to Officio Assassinorum, this is going to be an interesting one, because I'm not really sure that there's the right call for this. Part of the power of Assassinorum is that all of the assassins are good in very different situations, which is one of the reasons that you can, if you've brought the stratagem, swap between them before the game begins. But I think the most flexible and oftentimes the most damaging of them is the Calidus Assassin. Not because it actually kills your opponent's models, but because it bleeds their CP store so quickly with that Reign of Confusion ability, forcing your opponent to spend additional CP on their stratagems. Very annoying. Before we close out the Imperium here, we'll move on to some weirder Imperium subfactions with the Eleusinian Starstriders. These are a kill team release that I think has some really interesting profiles in it, and that I wish you could see wider play in 40k, because some of them are phenomenal. And one of the phenomenal datasheets that I want to talk about is Niche's Squad? Niche's Squad? It certainly fills a niche in an Eleusinian Starstrider detachment. Unfortunately, a big downside of the Starstriders, and one of the reasons that you don't see them, or you can't really see them, is that basically, I think all of their units are, you can only bring one of them in your army. But holy crap, if Niche's Squad could be cloned, and you could take multiple of them, they would be phenomenal. The unit themselves are essentially Imperial Guard veterans that you bring in your troops slot, but come with some really cool special weapons. You get 6 models, one of which has a 2 damage, range 12, strength 4 shotgun, one of which has a 24-inch 4-shot heavy rotor cannon that's strength 4 with an AP 1 for 2 damage. And all of whom can throw concussion grenades for D3 shots that go to strength 4, 2 damage if you are within 1 inch of an obstacle or area terrain feature. For 40 points, though, this unit is, like, actually ridiculous. They have really reasonable ranged output, especially for a backline utility troops unit. And at 40 points for 6 of them, they only come out to about 7 points a model, and all of their war gear is free. So if you could take multiple of them, you have those 2 damage rotary cannons just for free everywhere. It'd be awesome. They also unlock some datasheet specific stratagems, which is pretty fun. Especially if you're bringing their leader, Elucia Vane, they unlock some free CP that you can spend on those stratagems, which is pretty cool. But they are locked behind that annoying Starstrider keyword. You can basically only fit them in a patrol if you bring specifically the units from that kill team release, so they don't fit into any other Imperium armies very well, and you can't take more than one of them. With good reason, because this unit would be crazy if you could take more than one. Next up, we'll move to Sisters of Silence. I'm going to put in Prosecutors in here as the cheapest unit in the Sisters of Silence, and these models actually see play quite often in Adeptus Custodes because they can be brought in Custodes detachments without breaking anything. And for Custodes, they're the cheapest unit they can have access to. For only 60 points, you get 5 models with a 3+ armor save. You can sit in the back, hang out on your objectives, perform actions. They're just really good in that capacity. And yeah, they're bolt guns. They have a 3-up weapon skill, unlike Sisters of Battle. 2 attacks apiece. They're pretty solid and are relatively inexpensive, especially in a faction made up of 50+ point infantry models. And with that, last but certainly not least, we will move to everybody's favorite, the Space Marines. Now, previously, I did our datasheet deep dive on the Relic Contemptor Dreadnought, especially with the Volkite Culverins, and I said, this might be the best unit in Space Marines, but given the criteria of the video, I've elected to actually choose a different best unit for Space Marines, because Volkite Relic Contemptors don't necessarily fit into every Space Marine subfaction. While most lists will bring them, and most lists should bring them, there is another unit that sees play in more Space Marine lists, and that is the Vanguard Veteran Squad. Especially with their standard loadout of a Jump Pack, Storm Shield, and Lightning Claw. These guys throw out a bunch of attacks. They're relatively fast. They can damage both light infantry with a high volume of attacks or heavy stuff because they reroll their wounds. And they're difficult to kill on the swing back. With access to Rites of War or other abilities to give them objectives secured, they can fight over your opponent's objectives and just be really annoying. And the biggest upside as well is regardless of what chapter you're playing, Vanguard Veterans are almost always useful. They basically have a spot in every chapter, whether you're playing Iron Hands and you can abuse their rerolls with Mercy as weakness to generate extra hits, whether you're playing Salamanders to give them +1 to wound, or Blood Angels, or whether you're just playing White Scars and making them ridiculously fast and with those 2 damage Lightning Claw swings. Essentially every single Space Marine chapter will find a use for Vanguard Veterans, and that's why you see them in most Space Marine lists. Now, I want to give a shout out here as well to the Apothecary, especially with the cheap Apothecary upgraded the Selfless Healer Warlord trait. That guy is insane value for points. For less than 100 points, he's going to regenerate more than 100 points of units every game, almost without fail, in addition to giving you a damage ignore roll and healing models, and he especially works well with those Vanguard Veterans. And also, Big shout out to the Relic and Tempter Dreadnought. That guy's sweet, especially with Volkite Culverins. Good profile into anything you're shooting at. Excellent into Drukhari as well, which is very important right now. And a weakness that Vanguard veterans actually have, which is, I think, one of the reasons that we're seeing the elite slots that were normally reserved for Vanguard veterans moving over to Relic and Tempters more lately. But those Relic and Tempters do sometimes run into lists where they're not necessarily supported as well as Vanguard veterans would be. And that's it. There we have it. Every faction in 40k, including some of the weird ones, we went through and talked about the #1 best unit in each one. This was a super fun video to do. Let me know down below if you enjoyed it, and I would love to do more silly videos like this one. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. I want to throw a shout out to my patrons, as well as YouTube channel members and Twitch subscribers. All those people help support me, help me make the content that I do, and I really appreciate all of you. With that, that's going to be it for this video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.